You're listening to the Goggler Podcast. Bahir and Uma with you. We're going to be talking today about The Holdovers, the brand new movie by Alexander Payne, starring Golden Globe winner and Oscar nominee Paul Giamatti. This is the first time they're collaborating since the excellent Sideways. And of course, Alexander Payne, if you don't know, has, I think, one of the most tremendous track records in cinema. Downsizing aside, a little bit of a touch and go.
Yeah, okay.
Everything else he's done, Citizen Ruth, Election, About Schmidt, Sideways, The Descendants, Nebraska, have been excellent films. I remember speaking to him in 2017 about downsizing. The movie had come out, it had been in cinemas. I think it was a month after the release. I started by saying, hey, I saw downsizing. And before I could continue, he just goes, I'm so sorry. He is one of those directors who is aware when something doesn't work. And I think that's quite interesting because I think anyone who knows how films are made kind of realize that it's not a simple, straightforward process. There is a lot that happens between what you're shooting on the day and the final product and the audience reaction.
Yeah.
The opposite of that being Quantumania, where everyone who put out the film thought it was the best thing ever and seemed genuinely shocked when the audience reacted in the way that they did.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting that Alexander Payne is such a self-aware filmmaker. And I bring that up because all of his movies feel very self-aware. They know exactly what they're doing, what the purpose is, and almost every time deliver on that promise. I pressed play on The Holdovers because I watched it about a month ago. I bought it on iTunes when it was released. I had no idea it was going to be released in Malaysian cinemas because movies like this rarely do. And I pressed play on The Holdovers. And within 30 seconds, I thought I was watching a movie that was made in the 1970s. Not a movie that was homaging the 1970s, mind you, but it felt like I had been transported into one of those classic films. Everything about the credit sequence, everything about the music and the way the movie felt, it was authentic. And I say that because that is a promise that the movie makes to you when it starts, and this movie delivers on that promise.
The Holdovers is a wonderfully sweet throwback to the films of the late 70s, early 80s. When watching a grouchy old man just take the piss out of some kids is just the best thing in the world. He plays this character that isn't that sweet, sweet teacher who's hoping for the best. This isn't Robin Williams from Dead Poets Society. He's not hoping for his students to be better people. He's just like, why aren't you better people?
There are shades of Dead Poets Society with regards to where the story goes. There are also shades of Curtis Hansen's Wonder Boys. Paul Giamatti plays this cantankerous teacher. He's pretty unpopular with the students. He's spent his life in this preparatory school, and we know there's a reason. Like, we think something is wrong. We don't know why someone as smart as him has dedicated his life, in inverted commas, to staying in this role. Like, why isn't he writing that book he was supposed to write?
I just saw him as a cantankerous old man that either has nowhere to go over Christmas or nowhere he wants to go. He wants to just stay on the school grounds and read his books and be left alone. I just saw him as just that.
So for me, that was there, but then I was always asking why. Because it felt like he had a backstory. It felt like he had a reason. Like, that wasn't his promise being fulfilled.
What I appreciated was that neither Alexander Payne, the director, nor Paul Giamatti plays it as a wink wink, I've got a secret that I'm trying to hide from everybody. So it doesn't become that annoying thing of trying to pull this cantankerous old man's backstory out of him. It's a very natural way it gets released later. It's almost accidental when we find out his backstory.
We have three major characters. Paul Hunnam, played by Paul Giamatti. Angus, played by Dominic Sessa. It's his first ever acting role.
Which is just crazy. Can I
Crazy.
just say that's just crazy?
He's only done stage plays at school before doing this, and he is amazing. And of course, you have Da'Vine Joy Randolph. She is incredible, and her character is the school chef who has lost her son to the war. And so you have these three characters. Dominic Sessa's Angus is yet again someone who is a holdover. If you're not familiar with the term holdover, a holdover is someone who's been left in school, is forced to stay at their boarding school over Christmas for reasons. They may not have a home to go back to, or in Angus's case, his mum and new stepdad want some time for themselves and are going off on holiday and have essentially ditched him. It's about these three left behinds, and they all have their own weighty issues and are forced to not just stay together, but get along for this Christmas period. I don't want to call it a Christmas movie, even though it is a Christmas movie, because when you call it a Christmas movie, it evokes certain ideas that you may have. And sure, the atmosphere is there. It's Christmas, there's snow, it's cold, everyone is yearning to be elsewhere when they can't. All of that's there. But it is not cozy, and it is not.
Filled with warmth of family and love. There are a couple of title cards throughout this film dating the situation of the Holdovers, right? Day one, etc., etc. We don't see Christmas Day.
I don't think we do.
Yeah, so for that in itself, I think is an interesting choice from Alexander Payne to set it over Christmas, to release it as a film around the Christmas period, but then avoid actually Christmas. They go to a party on Christmas Eve, and I think we then see them again on the 27th. We never actually see Christmas Day, which is a choice, which is a great choice.
As in all Alexander Payne movies, the humor is sarcastic and biting, and there's a real edge to it. It's not necessarily a comedy, but there's enough darkness in here that'll make you laugh. I've seen the movie twice now, and it's a weird movie to describe because I think the first time I watched it, I absolutely loved it. The second time I watched it, I loved it even more. The second time I watched it, I felt I may even have underestimated how great a movie this is. There are certain decisions that Alexander Payne makes with regards to the dramatics of this film, which actually are so smart. Like in the hands of a lesser filmmaker, there would be fights.
Yes,
You
yes.
mentioned the party on New Year's Eve, and the way that whole scenario played out was a subversion of what you would expect. So basically, Mary gets drunk. I mean, it's a Christmas party. She's lost her son. It's a very difficult time for her. And they're all off doing their own thing, right? Paul Giamatti's doing his own thing. Angus has found this girl that he kind of has a crush on. They get summoned back into the kitchen because Mary's drunk and losing it.
Yeah.
And the way that next scene plays out is so sweet and considered. It's not that blow up that you expect.
The two moments that I found most interesting was when Angus calls in Paul Giamatti's character and they go to the kitchen. There's just a simple locked off shot of the four of them actually. So it was Mary, who is obviously going through a thing at the moment, Angus, who had just called Paul Giamatti's Paul Hunnam into the kitchen, and the fourth, Danny, who's a sort of caretaker janitor around the school, and they're just standing there not entirely knowing what to do about Mary. But then the following scene when they walk out of the party and Angus is just like, yeah, we're just going to drop her off and then we'll come back, right? Because there's this girl that I really want to get to know better. And Paul Hunnam's just like, no, we can't, because, Mary can't be left alone, etc., etc. So for me, it's almost always like Angus is being very selfish, even around the other holdovers, in him almost trying to be a person that he really isn't. He's trying to be smarter than he actually is. He's trying to outsmart people he didn't need to. When Angus and Paul go to the cinema and watch a movie and he tries to sneak out, and Paul's just like, just tell me. You could have just told me and we would have gone, right? And I think it's the upbringing of a child who's had issues with family, who thinks he has to be strong while also being a real dick about everything.
There's a little bit of that rich boy elite that seeps through from time to time.
Yeah, but I'm never really convinced that he was that rich boy elite. It's a front that he's had to put up to save himself throughout the four different schools he's been kicked out of.
At its core, the Holdovers is that found family story. Complete strangers forced together into a situation, find themselves and find love for each other. And I think the way Alexander Payne delivers this is just a masterclass in capturing character. The dialogue between all of these individuals is perfect. You've got everything from Paul starting off this movie by feeling nothing but disdain for his students to developing a begrudging respect and eventual love for them. They're all learning about each other from each other and they're becoming better people. Like that, I feel is the core driving factor of most Christmas movies, but also just in general family stories as well. And I think what the Holdover does and what Alexander Payne does really, really well is package that in a way that doesn't feel cloying or overly sentimental. Everything feels incredibly real. Like between the beginning and the end of this film, you believe that Paul has been through a journey in those 15 days and that he has learned something and that he has become a different person.
I just thought of something. It really feels like Paul Giamatti's Paul is at the end of the movie where Robin Williams' John Keating is in the beginning of his. Because Paul has spent his entire career having to teach little shitheads entitled sons of prominent whoever's, but having spent time with Angus in this 15 days, he's realized, you know what, not all of them are a pain in the ass. So he leaves it at the end of this film being, I wouldn't say enlightened, but almost like, okay, not all kids suck.
I think the Holdovers and Past Life share a lot in common in that they're deceptively simple, but
Mm.
actually incredibly complex movies, especially in the way the main characters are drawn. So much like the Holdovers, Past Lives 2 doesn't deal in melodrama. And I think that was the strongest part of that movie. But when you're watching that movie, and if you're not paying attention, sometimes it doesn't feel like it's important enough because
Right.
nothing big happens.
Yep. Yep.
And with the Holdovers as well, as you're watching it, nothing big happens. All of these stories kind of progress in a quiet and very determined way. And yet, at the end of the film, I think you feel like you have changed along with these characters.
I liked that the movie didn't have these big blowout moments. As I was watching it, I could almost see them coming, right? You're like, okay, here's the first big blowout. And then it's going to be, oh, this is where the next one would be, or this is where the next one would be. It feels like in 2023, when you make a drama, you almost need those volume jumps. You need something massive, dramatic, something show stopping to happen. But this movie never does it. There's one sort of fight in air quotes fairly early on between Angus and another holdover. Again, it feels like one of those fights people have in school, right?
It's two boys bickering.
There's a punch or two thrown, but after that, you're just going to go run and have an exercise session together, PE session together. So it's not the end of the world. It's just a blowout of emotions, right? And I like that this movie never devolves into a screaming match, into a you're not my dad speech kind of thing. It's sort of just really human and really emotionally mature filmmaking.
That's absolutely right. It is emotionally mature filmmaking that no one does anymore. That was my first reaction when the movie ended. How did this get made in the modern Hollywood studio era? There are a handful of movies like this. The Holdovers, George Clooney keeps making them. The Boys in the Boat, The Tender Bar. It's interesting that those movies, I mean, The Boys in the Boat just came out, but it's interesting that both those movies don't get the kind of attention they deserve because they're serious stories featuring some of the strongest characters that we've seen in cinema. It's some of the most grown up filmmaking that actually doesn't get the right attention. I'm glad The Holdovers is because I think this is definitely one of the most human films I've seen in a very long time.
But it's weird because the holdovers is getting the kind of attention mostly because of Paul Giamatti's work. not to knock Paul Giamatti or Alexander Payne, but it doesn't feel like particularly challenging work for Paul Giamatti. You know what I mean? This isn't the hardest thing Paul Giamatti's done, but yet to give the Holdovers the attention it is getting based on his performance, I think is a mistake because it's everything together.
I think it's one of his most powerful performances, but does he just make it look easy? Is it because it's what we've come to expect from Paul Giamatti? Like, I look at Flower Moon, and I think that's one of the best performances De Niro has ever done. But you're like, well, I expect no less from Robert De Niro. And so when it comes to a part like this with a quippy, talky, cantankerous Paul Giamatti, it feels like, oh, wait, yes, of course he's going to do this well. He's Paul Giamatti. He is the ultimate character actor.
I expect this from Paul Giamatti. I assume this would come from a Paul Giamatti work. Like, I'm almost surprised. I'm not almost. I was surprised when Paul Giamatti was Rhino in The Amazing Spider-Man 2.
Right.
This feels like a Paul Giamatti movie, and I love these Paul Giamatti movies. Again, I'm not trying to downplay any of the accolades the film or Paul Giamatti is getting, because I think they're both well deserved. It just feels like what you said is correct. This is what I expect from an Alexander Payne movie and a Paul Giamatti movie. Doesn't make it any less impressive, doesn't make it any less good, doesn't make me love it any less. But yeah, this is what I expected, and this is what I got, and this is what I want.
The other thing that you should do when you go and watch The Holdovers, and you really should watch The Holdovers, it's actually showing on the big screen. And this is a movie that's well worth watching on the big screen. Even if you happen to have watched it digitally already, watch it again. It's a real masterclass in storytelling with regards to how Alexander Payne uses everything that's around the film as well. From the setting of Paul Hunnam's room, where he sits down and works and writes and sleeps, it tells you so much about the character.
Mm.
The mention about his unfinished book project, for example, is not something they necessarily dwell on. But even the way Paul Giamatti's Paul Hunnam talks about a monograph versus a book. And he goes, well, the monograph is something shorter. He's self-deprecating in the way that, oh, I don't know if I've got enough in me to write a whole book, but there's this shorter thing that I might be clever enough to do. And all of these things tell you so much about the character without over-explaining it, without having some giant blow up with another character going, well, you're not as smart as you think you are, and all of that shit, right? It's all there. Mary, Da'Vine Joy Randolph's character, numbs her pain with bourbon every night. She's always drinking, she's always drunk. And yet, even that drunkenness is shown with such nuance and subtlety. She's drunk, she's sitting on her couch, she's watching game shows every night. That is her depression, and then she falls asleep. I love the way all of that is depicted because that's the show don't tell. That's the stuff that is so rare in cinema these days, at least in your major summer blockbusters, right? Everything needs to be spelt out in every single Netflix series.
It also shows the wide range of human emotion and human reaction to personal grief, right? Not everybody is going to go out to the bar, drink a whole bottle of scotch or whatever, and get into a fight or get into a car accident. That's not what always happens. Yes, it happens sometimes, but not all the time. And I think Mary's version of it is more set in the time because it's the 1970s. She talks about how life is difficult for her as a black woman in America. And just the way Mary is just able to sit down and drink and sort of forget her pain is, to her at least, the most and the least she could do, I think. She doesn't want to get into a fight. She doesn't want to blame the American government. It's not about the bigger picture. It's about her having to deal with the grief in the only way she knows how.
All of these performances are some of the best of the year. I think they deserve every accolade and acknowledgement. I was a little disappointed that Dominic Sessa didn't get an Oscar nomination, but then I thought about it for a little bit and went, hey, you know what? Nothing good has ever come from an actor receiving a nomination that young.
That's true.
It's interesting because I think the Academy likes nominating the young ingenues. They will give Jennifer Lawrence a nomination when she's very, very young. But when it comes to male actors, they prefer when you're slightly older and more grizzled.
You're right. It feels like Hollywood just wants an older man acting in a sort of more serious film about serious matters. I agree with you. I think this was a great performance from Dominic Sessa. And good God, if this was his first job out of the block, I hope he gets a good agent because his phone's going to be ringing. It almost feels like the Academy would go, he hasn't earned it yet. First time out of the gate, not even any Broadway shows. He's just done school stuff. Show me what's next, I think is what a lot of people would say in Hollywood.
The Holdovers has made me want to go back and watch all of the other Alexander Payne movies. I forget just how accomplished a director he is and how he brings these things to life. That journey of self discovery, that insight into the male psyche, it's all very, very well done. And the Holdovers is absolutely exceptional. And you know what? And also the 70s stuff, like it just looks amazing. Everything from the production design to the choice of music to the way the film looks to those credits, everything is just incredible. Go watch it. It's showing in Malaysian cinemas. It's such a rare opportunity to watch these sorts of movies on the big screen. Go check it out. You will not be disappointed. The Holdovers is now showing in Malaysian cinemas. Let us know what you think once you've seen it. You can reach out on all of our social media feeds, Goggler MY. You can also email us on podcast@goggler.my or send us a WhatsApp on the Goggler hotline, 012-524-5208. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Goggler Podcast.